Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Livermore. This episode is sponsored by the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment at the University of Virginia School of Law. With me today is Ronald Sandler, a professor of philosophy at Northeastern University. He writes on environmental ethics, emerging technologies, and ethical issues surrounding climate change, food, and species conservation. His books include Environmental Ethics, Theory in Practice, and The Ethics of Species. Ron, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So one of the themes of the podcast that we've turned over a couple of times in past episodes is the relationship between the various disciplines engaged in studying the environment. You've written in areas like conservation biology and climate change that are obviously highly influenced by scientific practice. So maybe just as a kind of initial question, what do you see the role of kind of philosophy, or even more generally the humanities, but I guess specifically in your instance, philosophy, in these conversations that are so heavily conditioned by the sciences?
Well, a lot of what's going on in conservation biology especially, but in terms of thinking about large-scale ecological and climatic change, climate change, and other kinds of ecological change, is thinking about how we ought to respond to these things. And so those questions about the oughts are questions that are normative. So they aren't the sorts of questions that could be settled just by the empirical sciences alone or projective sciences like modeling and such things. They're questions about what we ought to do. They're questions about what kind of society we want to be. And they're questions about that are related to what sorts of things are valuable, what sorts of things do we care about, what sorts of things should we care about, and how do we move forward in some pretty novel contexts in terms of thinking about how to protect those values. So good environmental philosophy, good environmental ethics, good normative thinking about what we ought to do in these contexts certainly need to be informed by our best science. Like, we need to know what the reality is of climate change, its causes. We need to understand what's driving biological and ecological change. We need to have as good an understanding as possible of extinction, what the causes of extinction are, what sort of strategies we have available to try to prevent them as much as possible. So we need really good science, but the science alone isn't enough, because the science alone won't tell us what matters, and it won't tell us how to respond well as moral agents, as people who care about the non-human world going forward.
Yeah, great. And it's interesting. I asked this question in part because some of my scientific friends and folks in the advocacy community will sometimes kind of say, well, we have to do what the science says. And I always like to bring in the philosophers to say, well, the science doesn't fully answer the question. A couple of straightforward ethical principles might tell us a fair amount when you combine it with the science, but the science alone is never really enough.
The science will tell us what is the case. It will allow us to think about what actions will likely have what outcomes, but it never alone is enough to tell us what we ought to do. There has to be some value or some normative principle that's there, and often they're buried a little bit. So people often have these normative ideas working in the background that they might not even be aware of, right? So something like, we ought to save all species, right, or something, right?
Right. Well, so on the species question, thinking about that, something you've obviously given a lot of thought to. This question in particular, maybe one way to say it is what is valuable about species. So one hypo that you referenced in a recent paper that I use in my law school class as well is this kind of hypothetical question of, well, say there's a project that has to go forward, and it either is going to kill 1,000 common pigeons, or it's going to wipe out the last 1,000 members of a rare or endangered species. and that are otherwise similar to pigeons in terms of their intelligence and their habits or whatever. And the question is, is one course of action worse than the other? Is it worse to kill 1,000 common pigeons? I don't think many people think that. Or is it worse to wipe out the last members of the species, which probably many people would say is worse? And then the question is kind of why. So I guess just to kind of turn it over, obviously you've thought about that hypo. Initial question is, do you think it is worse to kill the last 1,000 members of the species? And then if so, what is it about that that is actually worse?
I do. I agree. I share that intuition, right, or that judgment that it's worse to kill the last few remaining. And right, what the thought experiment is meant to do is to set it up so that if you look at just the individual organisms, the pigeons or the other species, call them smidgens maybe, that have all the same capacities, then it can't be the suffering of the individuals or the deaths of the individuals that's what explains why it's worse to kill the smidgens than the pigeons. So the question is, what could it be? And there's different possible answers. One could be that it just decreases the diversity of kinds of organisms that there are in the world. And we might think that more diversity of this sort is good. And so decreasing diversity of in the biological world is bad. So it's worse because of the diversity. And a way in which you might flesh that out even a little bit more is to say what is worse about what explains what's important about maintaining the biological diversity is that each of those species are a distinctive form of life. They have a unique way of going about the world. They encode different genetic histories, the natural history that has led up to that form of life. And they are each a locus of potential future evolutionary possibilities. And so when you lose the smidgens, in this case, you don't just lose the 1,000 organisms, right? So that's just the death of 1,000 organisms. You also lose that bit of natural history, that unique bit of natural history, that unique set of future possible evolutionary possibilities, which you don't with pigeons because there's loads more there. So I do think it's possible to substantiate those intuitions or judgments that it's worse to kill the last remaining members than it would be to kill common species. And what it reveals to us is something about why species are valuable, why that level, that taxonomic unit is something that we care about.
And it has to do with this kind of the information that's encoded or the relationship between the kind of natural history of that unit, that it's a meaningful unit from this perspective of kind of existing backward in time and projecting itself forward in time. Is that roughly the idea? Yeah,
and that it's connected to a distinctive form of life, like a distinctive way of being in the world, of going about reproducing itself, of feeding and living and predating and being predated on, and all the sorts of things that go with being a kind of biological organism in the world that are the sorts of things that we find, I think rightly, kind of amazing about all sorts of different, right? The diversity of the biological world is a diversity of ways in which organisms go about their lives, right? And salmon and eagles and coyotes, or if you don't like coyotes, wolves, if you don't like wolves, fox, whatever, are each a distinctive form of life, and that has evolved over many, many, thousands and millions of years to be that form. Now, this isn't to say that this was done intentionally, right? That's part of what's amazing about this, is the unintentional evolutionary processes that have given rise to this thing. But if you lose the last few members of a species, you lose that form. And that's the extra loss there, that way of being in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And then I think it's kind of we talk about it's amazing, right? That it's just the variety of life, the diversity of life forms that we have on this planet is just something that strikes awe in when we contemplate it. That it seems to be, if I take it correctly, it's part of what. That's important to the claim here. I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, because one of the takeaways that I took from one of your earlier books, The Ethics of Species, is that, and this might not still be your view. I mean, that always happens too. We can always revise our views, but that the idea that species don't have what you call objective final value, right? That kind of value in and of themselves. Their value comes from maybe an appropriate way that humans, kind of relate to the natural world and so on. So maybe I wonder if it's worth parsing through the distinction between kind of the idea that there would be, a kind of objective final value, or some people talk about inherent value, that kind of thing, versus the kinds of values that you're talking about that might spring from maybe an appropriate relationship that humans have to these things.
Yeah. So this gets us into the philosophical terrain a little deeper. So suppose we take this idea that species have value above and beyond the individual organisms that comprise them. Mm-hmm. And we can talk also about what makes a species and what kind of thing is a species, those sorts of things. But suppose that we can fix that, and we can say, they have value. Then we can say, well, what sort of value is it that it has? And this has been one of the main philosophical issues associated with environmental ethics over the last many decades, because it's connected to how we ought to respond to their value, what type of value they have. So one view is that they have. So one type of distinction in value is between instrumental and final value, and that's the distinction between something that is valuable for what it is versus something being valuable as a means to an end. So if something's valuable as a means to an end, it provides services or something like this, it's a resource, then that would be instrumental value. If something's valuable if it has final value, then it's valuable for what it is in addition to or beyond what it is, what its usefulness. And that's how we think of the value of other human beings, right? Human beings are useful to other human beings in all kinds of ways, but we don't think they're only instrumentally valuable, right? That's why you can't treat humans in certain kinds of ways, because they have final value. They have rights. They're not mere things to be used. So on the view I was describing before about the value of species and explaining that thought experiment, that is a view that would suggest that they have final value. Okay. But within final value, there's sometimes a distinction that's made between things that have final value because they're valued that way and things that have final value independent of their being valued that way. So on this distinction, the subjective sort of value is when something has final value just because we humans value it for what it is and not merely for what it does. And there's lots of things that have value like this, like mementos or heirlooms or these sorts of things, right? We value them. They're just an object, but they come to be valued for more than that. When some people think of species, they think that that it's not just that we do value them that way, but that we should value them that way. And that is my view, that they should be valued that way, because it's what I think of as a fitting response to an understanding of, as you were saying before, the way in which they're a unique form of life and they came to be and they are future evolutionary possibilities. Like it's the way to appreciate them. It's a way to value them. It's the way to understand ourselves in relation to them. But what I don't think is that if there were no people around at all, that these things would still have value. That is, value in a world in which they're valuers. So the way I think about it is that they that valuing them for what they are is the most justified response. It's the way in which we ought to value them. But we can set aside then questions about whether they have objective value in the sense that there would be value in the world if there was only them or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the view that I find problematic in the book. I'm not sure how to make. I'm not sure how one would justify that adequately.
Right. There's kind of two forks here. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I'm jumping around my little schedule here a little bit. But
yeah.
There seems like there could be two forks here that I think maybe I'd be interested in exploring. So one is part of what I take it to be the source of kind of this objective final value is this notion of interests, that entities that have interests can have, we might think of as having objective final value, and species, it's hard to imagine, it's maybe not right to think of them as having interests. So that might be one thing that's worth exploring. The other thing that I think is interesting, and maybe I'll let you choose which of these you think is more interesting, is, the kind of ethics versus aesthetics in this domain. Because the subjective final value, the valuing things of themselves, as you said, kind of mementos or the like, I assume that great art would kind of fit into that category of things that, we think of as having value in and of themselves, and that maybe even we might say it's appropriate for people to value them in that way, right? They wouldn't have value if there were no people around. That probably doesn't make any sense. But it's appropriate for people to place value in those things in and of themselves. Now, I guess the question is that kind of value an ethical value, or like something that we would think is more kind of just aesthetic or something along those lines?
So I think that it depends on the details. I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by aesthetic value, what you count as that value.
Right.
So one thing that people say about art, right, is that its beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or something like that. It's just completely subjective, if you imagine that. But actually, real understanding and appreciation of art isn't quite like that. I mean, when you understand, it's not just how the thing looks, right? It's just not just the intrinsic relation between the colors and the material in the painting or something like that. That makes something valuable. It's that it was painted at a certain time by a certain person at a certain point in the history of the development of art. What was novel about it when it was done? So there is a way in which the more you can understand what's going on, the more you understand the context of the creation and the person who created it and the histories and the traditions, then it becomes fitting to value certain pieces of artwork more than others. Because they're a certain kind of accomplishment, right? And so it's not strictly in the eye of the beholder in those kinds of contexts. So I do think that there is some similarity there with the way in which we value species. Once you come to understand what they are, where they've come from, that they encode the natural history of the planet, that they are these unique forms of life that have arisen by these human-independent evolutionary processes, and that they're the locus of future possibilities and all of these sorts of things. Once you see them that way, it's fitting to value them. It's the right response to the kind of thing that they are.
Right.
And we can talk about that as a relation between our valuing and their properties without having to posit any kind of weird metaphysical stuff, right?
Universe,
it's appropriate for creatures like us to value them for what they are because of these sorts of things. So I do think that there's a bit of connection there. Now, what we call aesthetic, I mean, that's a whole different podcast right there. Right. To the question about whether species have interests. So this is something folks, some philosophers and environmental ethicists do think that species have interests above and beyond the individuals that comprise them. It's not. I think it's a difficult view to maintain. Because it's hard to make sense of benefit and harm to to a species. So you can benefit or harm individual wolves, but it's hard to make sense of how you benefit or harm Canis lupus or something like that. I mean, that's they're not alive. They don't feel anything.
Collectively.
The species, the Canis lupus, isn't a living organism. Individual wolves, yes, of course.
Right. So part of the reason why I think that the ethics versus aesthetics thing can be interesting is kind of how sometimes I think environmental questions are processed in the public domain, how we talk about them, and the kinds of objections people raise to environmental law and so on. So kind of where I'm going with this is if someone kind of says, look, that the ethical claims are kind of different in a sense than aesthetic claims, that the kinds of arguments that people can raise against them. So if someone says, look, we're undertaking this this policy, this conservation policy, because we have ethical grounds for doing it, right? Then we can do things like, say, take away someone's property or place restrictions on their activities or the like, right? The Endangered Species Act obviously places all kinds of restrictions on what people can do in order to conserve species, to avoid extinctions. If that's an ethical thing that if we're doing it in order to, because we have to, right? We have some kind of moral obligation to preserve the species or like, that seems like a different kind of argument to be made than one that is kind of aesthetic in orientation, right? So if we were to say, we think they're beautiful, or, we're going to preserve, some buildings or something like that, right? In a downtown area, and we're going to engage in historic preservation, which we do this, right? Same thing. And we place restrictions on what people can and can't do with their property in order to preserve kind of historic values. It does seem like a different kind of enterprise to say, we're doing this in order to, for kind of aesthetic reasons versus we're doing it because we have a moral obligation to do it. Now, maybe this distinction that I'm drawing is not a useful one. So I'm kind of just curious what your thoughts are about, if there's just a symmetry between these things, or if there is, different kinds of claims being made in different domains.
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we've been talking about previously is the way in which you might ground claims that species have final value or intrinsic value or value for what they are, independent of their usefulness to people and independent of that. And now I gave an argument which was essentially that we ought to value them that way because that's the appropriate response to a proper understanding of the sorts of things that they are. So it's not just a kind of aesthetic appreciation in that sense. It's not just that we like looking at them or something like that. It's not just subjective. It's that we ought to value them for what they are. Now, that whole discussion we just had was focusing just on a certain way in which species are valuable for the kind of thing, the kind of life form that they are. But species are valuable in all kinds of other ways too that can ground the kind of obligations and responsibilities and ultimately the sorts of restrictions that you're talking about. I mean, they can be central to cultural practice and so have all kinds of cultural value, and so they ought to be preserved for those reasons. They can be extraordinarily instrumentally valuable to providing resources and services for everything from storm resiliency to fisheries productivity, to providing clean water and these such of things. And they can also be the subject of justice in the sense that, or we might say the object of justice, in the sense that nobody owns the biodiversity of country or an area or the world or something like that, right? It's a shared communal thing. And as a matter of justice to other people, to current people, to future people, it might be that we have an obligation not to significantly diminish the diversity of the biological world. So I think that when you provide a full accounting of all the ways in which species and biodiversity are valuable, cultural, final value, aesthetic value, as an object of justice, instrumentally valuable, then the The normative justification for policies and practices that protect biodiversity are overdetermined. We have more than enough good reasons to want to avoid species extinctions and especially and biological depletion, even when it doesn't involve species distinctions. Now, there's going to be hard cases, and that's why we have to have a right accounting of what and how things are valuable, so we can help reason through those cases when sometimes there does seem to be trade-offs that have to be made or compromises that have to be made. But in general, I think species conservation, biodiversity conservation is overdetermined by all those sorts of values.
Yeah. No, it's one of those things that's there are some interesting philosophical questions, but a lot of times, it almost doesn't matter how we answer them because everyone points in the same direction. Just says, okay, we should be doing more conservation.
And it's interesting in documents, like in the Endangered Species Act, right? It calls out all these different ways, cultural value and historical value, and it just calls out a lot of instrumental values and all sorts of things. So there's an awareness of the ways in which the multitude of ways in which species and biodiversity are valuable.
Yeah, I do. Well, just one kind of maybe final question on this line is, this does raise, I think, the question though of whether we tend to focus too much on species in environmental law and policy, say in the U.S., where we have, the Endangered Species Act is such a powerful, it's such an important part of our law, and it has this peg in particular of species, and now it's used in lots of ways to generate conservation that's more broad, right? You have kind of keystone species, or you have a species, where you protect the spotted owl, and it, protects it protects ecosystems, and it does lots of things other than just protect the individual animals or a particular line of species. But I guess this comes up in the context of thinking of you've written about kind of transplanting species from one place to the other. And one of the things that it seems that you've said in your work is that's kind of a mistake, is to that's focusing too much on species. Like, it's one thing to protect a species in its place. It's another thing to kind of pick it up and move it to an entirely different location. We actually lose a lot of value. It's not clear what we maintain when we do that. So I guess the more general question is, do you think that the kind of conservation law and policy in the states at least is too species oriented? And then the kind of related question is about this kind of moving species around, and is that a wise policy?
Those are both great questions. So it is an interesting feature, I think, of the way in which conservation policy in the United States has moved, right? Is that the Endangered Species Act is so powerful because it creates these critical habitats, and designated species can function as umbrella species for conserving lots of other things, that it becomes focused on getting on those designations and on the species conservation, when oftentimes what actually is the most important thing is getting the spaces conserved. And we do that as well, right? Parks and national parks and state forests and other sorts of things, restrict activities in those spaces to try to conserve and preserve the things that are in those areas. So it's not exclusively with species, but the Endangered Species Act is definitely extremely powerful in the United States. It is a really interesting question, a question that people are beginning to think more about in the context of global climate change and macro scale ecological change, anthropogenic change more generally, whether we should think more about endangered ecosystems, for example, and about whether we need policies that focus on identifying the types of systems that are endangered, whether or not we need to focus more, and this is increasingly being done, on connectivity between different habitats and protected areas so that species, population, systems can reconfigure in response to these rapid changes. In answer to your question, it seems like we ought to have a broader view of conservation than just species conservation. And this is also true because you can have massive biological depletion without extinction. Right. So, on some studies, 70% of assessed vertebrate species, the populations of populations of assessed species have decreased 70%. Not always with many extinctions, but just the number of individuals in the population have gone way down. Or if you think about fisheries, we have, over 90% of global fisheries are fully or overexploited. So that's massive biological, 100 million tons of biological diversity pulled out of the oceans every year. And these aren't really fisheries, and we call them fisheries, but they're ecological systems. So you can have massive biological depletion and impact without extinction. So I do think we need to be in conservation context thinking beyond extinction for all of these reasons, because the systems and the habitats are really important, and because you can have depletion without extinction. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of the things that I talk about in at the end of my Endangered Species Act portion of my class. I point out the number of species that are listed, and then point to the number of species that are likely to be threatened or go extinct in the next 100 years due to these big kind of macro global level things like climate change and ocean acidification and the like. And really the kind of one by one stopping extinctions one at a time just doesn't seem like a viable policy. It starts to seem not like a viable policy approach once you start to think about there's going to be tens of thousands, potentially millions of extinctions in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, the extinction crisis that we're facing is going to be one that you can't handle with one-offs, right? I mean, if we think about, estimates vary, but 15 to 20 eukaryotic plant or animal species, and then you think about the projections on extinction rates over the next century, which, we could be looking at, 1 million extinctions. So you're not going to be able to get 1 million species listed under this or that act. What we need are strategies that capture and protect large amounts of species, but also the ecological systems and the spaces where they can reconfigure. And that's not to say that the Endangered Species Act isn't super important, and that focusing on particular species isn't important. In many, many cases it is, and in many, many cases the kinds of threats to species are ones that can be addressed. But it does seem like we need to think more broadly and more innovatively in the context of the massive extinction and biological depletion context.
Yeah. So one of the this is kind of this changes this topic a little bit from things that we're doing that are terrible, like global climate change, to what we could do to kind of, what we're talking about now are kind of mitigate some of the harms that we're engaged in, right? But one question I think is interesting, I should be curious again about your thoughts on this. I think I personally find it to be a kind of a deep-ish question anyway, is about things that we could consider doing that would be kind of just beneficial to creatures in the natural world, to individual animals and the like. And I think in part because it might illuminate some of the ways that you think, or I'd be curious about anyway, whether it illuminates some of the ways that you think about these issues. So the basic hypo that I'm interested in is this policing nature idea, right? That we could go out and there are animals, that there's a lot of suffering in the natural world, and that we could actually reduce some of that suffering. Let's just say to animals, just to start with, right? That predation causes a lot of suffering, and we could go and we could feed the predators soy-based protein and save the prey from being kind of torn to shreds. And kind of in this interventionist way. And I take it from at least some of the things from the little snippets in that I've seen of yours that you don't find that a very attractive idea. And I'd be curious just on your thoughts on why that's not. And because I think it does in a sense link up to some of the things that we've been talking about kind of our relationship to the natural world and the like.
Yeah, so there's both practical and theoretical reasons why I find this to be an extremely strange idea for how we should engage with the natural world. So one is that there's a background view here that all suffering is bad, and that all suffering calls upon us, humans, moral agents, to alleviate it. But that seems a particularly odd view. I mean, causing suffering unnecessarily to other people or to non-human animals, that's, we might say that's bad. But there's suffering that happens in human life all the time that is part of life, and people need to go through it. And there's same with thinking about the non-human world. I mean, the natural world is a world of predation. I mean, it's just the way the population dynamics work. There's more offspring than can survive. There's everything needs to get energy from somewhere else. This is the wildness and autonomy and spontaneity and selection process. This is what it is. And so looking at that and then applying a principle like what we might call active beneficence, that you ought to try to reduce suffering as much as possible, seems to misunderstand the kind of thing that the non-human world is. So there's a kind of background conception there about what our relationship to the world is, what the non-human world is, and those sort of things. The other thing that I just find odd about it is the practicality. I mean, now this isn't to say that when humans do something that injures a non-human wild animal, that there's not, in that particular instance, good reason to try to redress it because we've caused the harm or something like that. But that's different from saying we ought to go into the natural world and identify predators and try to feed them something else so that they don't do these sorts of things. I mean, how on earth are we going to implement that in any sort of scale in ways that don't then cause other kinds of harms or wrongs, and that don't significantly diminish other things that have to do with animal welfare, because it's not just about suffering, it's also about autonomy, it's about living species typical forms of life and other sorts of things. So it also involves this kind of narrow conception of what makes for a good wild animal life. So yeah, I do have concerns about those very interventionist views on how we ought to relate to the non-human world.
And so then maybe like a kind of a follow-up question is how much of the, this is an action in action distinction kind of thing at some level. Do you think that carries over just, and this in some ways is like a very general question, of kind of like your broad philosophical orientation, like kind of consequentialist deontological virtue ethics. Because in reading your work, one of the things I think is really interesting about it is that you do seem to draw from these different traditions and use these different kinds of forms of moral reasoning to address these questions. So I was kind of curious if you thought that the kind of human natural distinction marked a sharp boundary there, where we might say, oh, within human affairs, maybe we're not going to have a very strong action in action distinction, or if we're going to have it, we're going to have it for instrumentalist reasons, practical reasons, basically. But that broadly speaking, it doesn't kind of have foundational moral significance, but it does have a kind of foundational moral significance once we cross over into the kind of the non-human domain, or whether you're kind of in the philosophical school that would say, no, actually, we really, there is a difference between causing harm and alleviating suffering, and that we have obligations in the first kind of side of things that we don't have on the other side of things. That's
a good question and a big question.
Yeah.
So let me say, so I think that when we think about how we ought to respond to something that is important or has value or that matters or has a welfare, there's all different kinds of things. It's not enough to just know that thing has value or matters. We also have to think about our relationship with respect to it. So there is no denying that my children and other people's children have the same inherent worth or value or whatever. But that doesn't mean that I ought to treat other people's children or have the same obligations and duties to them as I do to my children. So the same is true of my dog and a wild wolf, right? They might both have similar capacities. They both have interests. They both have welfare, and they have well-being. And it might be that in both cases, I ought not cause them unnecessary suffering. So that's a way in which I ought to respond to them. But I have duties of beneficence to my dog that are part of my taking on the responsibility of having a pet, and also that have been developed over a relationship that has built over time to take care of her in a way that I don't have to a wild animal. So am I thinking about how we ought to respond to things that are valuable in the world? We have to think about both the value and our situatedness with respect to them. And so this is what I think is gotten off about these ideas that we should intervene into the wild, into nature, into those things. It's not a human non-human distinction, because my dog is non-human as well. It has to do with the fact that it has to do with the autonomy and independence and wildness of those particular entities. And again, that's why if I cause harm to them unnecessarily, that changes my relationship to them. And maybe I have a restitutive, restorative justice responsibility that I don't otherwise have, or that a community doesn't otherwise have.
Great. Yeah. So, of course, every question in philosophy just leads to more questions.
Yeah. Of course, so I totally ducked the consequentialist deontology virtue,
right? Which is fair enough.
Kind of thing, because I think that the normative relationships are laid out by understanding what's valuable and how we stand with respect to those values as agents, and that those are articulated in different sorts of ways. So, in some context, the way in which we do it, we need to respect the value of the thing, that I need to respect the autonomy of other human beings, and that's why I have to respect their rights, and that's kind of a that is what people would call a deontological sort of thing. But in other contexts, I need to promote the good, and the good might be the flourishing of non-human world, and that's what more people would think of as a kind of consequentialist thing, because you're promoting an outcome. But it's understanding the context and the values that are at stake.
Yeah, no, and I think part of what's personally fun about environmental ethics, environmental morality is, it almost requires, or it certainly challenges a lot of traditional morality. That's what's kind of so interesting about it, is we're developing a way of thinking morally that is pretty new, right? Whereas we've been doing other types of moral reasoning for a very long time. I mean, maybe this is another question. Is that part of what attracted you to environmental ethics as a domain, is that you get to kind of, approach really, in the history of human thinking anyway, pretty new kinds of problems?
Yeah, I mean, the systematically thinking through our ethical relationships and responsibilities and responsiveness to the non-human world is a fairly not that it wasn't happening, thousands of years ago, people were thinking about these things in certain kinds of ways, but in comparison to thinking about our moral relationships to other people, it's relatively new, and it really does create all kinds of interesting questions that we've covered quite a lot of, like how do we view these other sorts of things? How do we understand our relationship to them in a proper sort of way? What sorts of values does the non-human world have, and how should we respond to those values? And it's not clearly. The answer is not, well, just like they were people, right? Because they're not human beings, and they can't engage in certain kinds of reciprocal relationships, and they don't have certain kinds of capacities. So it's a different kind of it's a different set of questions, and they're urgent questions, and they're interesting questions, both conceptually and practically.
Yeah. So just, returning to the situatedness question, I think that, this, we'll kind of see where this goes. So the relationship to one's, pet or versus a wild wolf, or, one's own kids versus other kids, right? So there's the kind of two things is, if you there's maybe at some level, right, they all have the same objective value, but you personally have different obligations because of your situated relationship to those things. And now, the kind of meta question is, ultimately, then we're kind of really taking the broad perspective and saying, all right, everything has its own kind of objective moral value that is pretty agent neutral. And then what we ought to do is think about how to construct kind of our situated moral obligations and so on in light of that fact, right? So, which is to say, the world is better for everybody when people's moral obligations are situated and relationship based, right? And so that's kind of the same way that we might be cosmopolitans and say that national boundaries don't have kind of foundational moral significance, but it is good to, or at least arguably, one could argue that it is good to have these certain types of political communities that allow for certain types of affinity and policies and political discourse or whatever else, right?
Yeah, I mean, all people have equal worth, but not everybody's your neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the fact that people have worth places responsibilities on us that we need to take seriously, and that we often have to act upon and prevent harms and promote goods. But we also have, we have relationships with our neighbors that are built over time that place additional and different responsibilities on us.
Right. And we would, and I think the kind of addendum to that might be, we wouldn't want to live in a world, or it would be a worse kind of world for everyone if those neighborly relationships didn't mean something.
Well, it's just part of, I think this is, part of understanding the kinds of creatures that we are, mm-hmm. right? I mean, ethics is ultimately a question about how should we live as the kind of creatures that we are. And what we've been talking about is we are environmental creatures. We mm-hmm. have biological needs and dependencies. We're part of a biological world. We share an evolutionary origin with other species and so on. Mm-hmm. But we're also social creatures, and we have certain kinds of social networks and relationships, and strong social, immediate, caring, reciprocal relationships are also part of living a good human life, in addition to caring about the state of people around the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thinking about the kinds of creatures that we are, I think informs both why it's important to be a good neighbor, mm-hmm. and why it's important to value the biological diversity in the world.
Yeah. So I think this actually kind of springs from this is the kind of creatures we are question, which is, this isn't fixed, right? This changes over time. Humans, or at least collectively humans, are very different now than we were 50,000 years ago. Obviously, our impact on the environment is very different. Our access to information is very different. Our background knowledge is very different. Lots of things are different from what things were 50,000 years ago. And one kind of broad question, I think, is, as humans change, and specifically the relationship of humans to the natural environment, right? So we know a lot more about evolution than we knew, a few hundred years ago. And so I guess so maybe just to start tackling this is, one, does our state of knowledge actually, about something like evolution, does that directly have kind of consequences for how we ought to kind of engage with the world in a kind of a basic way? Whereas, again, several hundred years ago, maybe we knew what species were, but we didn't have nearly as crisp an idea of what a species was. That species went extinct wasn't altogether clear. And so we've learned a lot about the world. How do you see that interplay of, the state, our scientific understanding about the world then feeding into how we ought to, kind of act in the world, and kind of and not just we understand what the consequences of our actions are, right? That's straightforward. More of it changes how we kind of fundamentally relate to the world and kind of what we are vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crucial. So the fact that having an ecologically and evolutionarily informed worldview, right? The idea that we are ecologically dependent and vulnerable mm-hmm. in all sorts of ways, but also recognizing that we have a common evolutionary origin with other species, that evolution isn't trying to get anywhere. There's no such thing as the highest species. There's just different forms of life, and we're a really interesting form of life. But so too are octopi. They're a really interesting form of life too, and a distinctive way of going about the world. And we're really well adapted to surviving and reproducing in one context, but not in the context in which octopi are. Right. So there's, we're a unique species, but being a unique species is nothing unique to us. That understanding undermines claims about our having a special or unique or highest place in the ontological or metaphysical order of the world. And that's crucial to recognizing that the rest of the non-human world isn't so very different from us and isn't just a resource for us to use, right? It's not a clean ontological bifurcation between human beings and all the other stuff, right? And that undermines the dichotomy between breaking down that dichotomy breaks down or undermines the view that we should see ourselves as distinct from the rest of the world and the rest of the world as sort of this resource that's just ours for use, but instead we have an affinity within shared origins and shared dependencies and vulnerabilities, and that needs to go into thinking about how we should respond. We should respond to the world, and this comes up, to a question you asked earlier. This relates to a question you asked earlier about thinking through, like, what would it take to really respond to the extinction crises that we're facing, right? This is why a world in which it's just humans and a bunch of resources is a depleted world. We shouldn't see that as a good outcome. And what's driving the extinction crisis is essentially our consumption, right? Humans make use of 40% of the primary plant production of the planet. That is the energy that's produced by plants. We've exploited almost all the aquatic systems that we can for our food, ranges, but around 38% of the terrestrial surface of the Earth is used for our agricultural purposes. I mean, we could go on and on about all the ways in which we impact the world, and it just doesn't leave enough for other species. And so the only real large-scale response that's going to make a big dent in the extinction crisis. I mean, we can talk about particular species conservation strategies and designating areas and genetic interventions and other sorts of things, is going to reduce the share of planetary resources that humans use. Yeah, and seeing the rest of the world as not just a resource is crucial to the worldview that needs to shift to make that possible.
This is I don't know if this is an interesting question or not, but just with respect to that of kind of the share of resources that humans can use, we have converted to our use versus the share of resources that we might leave to what we would call maybe natural systems. Although you point out, of course, that humans are natural in a very broad sense. We come out of the natural world, we evolved in the same conditions as other species. But do you see that as a justice question? That it's a question of justice between humans and non-humans, or is justice the wrong framing? And if it is, how do we get at that question? Like, how do we get traction on the question of what the right amount of, say, total aggregate resources to devote to humans versus to the rest of the natural world?
So it definitely is an interesting question. So I think there's kind of a narrow conception of justice and a broad conception of justice. So the narrow conception of justice is justice that's tied to the arrangements of social, political, and economic institutions and the roles that folks have in those institutions and the distribution of resources made by those institutions and the amount of power that folks have within those institutions, like all sorts of institutional related justice questions. And I think that's the more common sense of people talk about justice. So in that sense, I think it's hard to think about justice between the species. But if you think just broadly distributive justice or access justice or resource, then maybe you can make sense of, it's unfair that one species would use 40% of the planetary resources when there's 15 million, 20 million other species out there. So that's one thing. I think the question to ask, so I think it's hard to say, well, there's proposals out there, right? I mean, hopefully the conservation on biological diversity is going to, hopefully these meetings that are scheduled to happen coming up will happen. And there's some talk that there's going to be a proposal adopted to try to set a goal of protecting 30% of the planetary surface or land and sea for conservation, and the other people have talked about the half Earth proposal and these sorts of things. So I mean, people do try to set targets. It's hard to say what exactly the right target would be. I think the question that I try to at least encourage my students to think about is how can we live flourishing human lives alongside or in relation to other species and other organisms flourishing as well. And those are very often going to be lives that, and it's possible, right? Like, I think there's reasons to be optimistic. I mean, it does require making changes. Like, it's pretty clear that if we eat less beef or less meat, this is going to have positive ecological benefits on the planet, like in a pretty big way. Like, if everybody reduces their beef consumption, if people in affluent nations reduce their beef consumption 75%, that's like a huge benefit, right? And that has costs, but is that really going to undermine the extent to which we can flourish? I mean, if people change their traveling behavior so that they have less emissions with flying, is that really going to undermine how good a life that they can live? I mean, we just have to reorient our conceptions of what a good life is back to focusing on relationships and certain kinds of experiences and building skills and talents and community, rather than the consumption and acquisition of material goods. Not that we shouldn't have material goods. Right. I'm not saying we should go like the goal here isn't zero, but it is temperance. It is thinking about simplicity. It is thinking about waste and what is a distraction from living good, meaningful lives that would also enable other species and ecological systems to flourish more as well.
Great. So this is going to be a totally unfair last question because it just gets into a ton of very complicated stuff. But just it does strike me as the natural follow-up, which is so consuming less would certainly be one way to reduce the kind of footprint that humans have on the planet. Another one it was another kind of proposal that was similar in a sense of reducing human total footprint is less discussed these days, but this is about the total human population. So there's a lot of people, and of course, for whatever amount of consumption, you can always increase the population to have a whatever footprint you want. And so I'm curious how you think about those issues. I think these days, there's a standard thing is just like, look, we don't have to worry about population. It's really about high consuming individuals in the rich world. And if we were to reduce that, then, the problem kind of goes away, at least for a while. But I think the issue is over the long term, if we continue to kind of increase population size, that's, ultimately you're going to run into this problem of the human footprint is just going to kind of increase over time, even if we reduce our consumption levels.
So, I mean, it is absolutely the case that how much we consume, how many people are consuming, and the amount of resources that are necessary per unit of consumption, let's say, like the efficiency of production, which is a technology, and other kinds of efficiency issues are all part of this. Now, when we talk about reducing human share of resources, the question is, so I don't think the way to think about it is necessarily like, what's the goal that we set, right? We have to think about the things or the policies or the practices that would get us there or get us moving in the right direction. And those policies and practices too have to be evaluated in terms for their ethical acceptability,
Right, of course.
right? And the best options are the ones that are win-wins or win-win-wins, right? So there's pretty good evidence that increasing educational and workforce opportunities for women, increasing access to healthcare and family planning will reduce fertility rates in a pretty strong way, increasing security, decreasing huge inequalities. These are all sorts of things that can be addressed that can lead to lower levels of consumption, lower levels of population growth. And I would add this shifting of the idea that, if you watch TV, right, the picture is still like what's the good life? What's the good American life? It is the maximizing the amount of stuff that you have. But we know that people's pursuit of materialistic pursuits actually, there's good evidence, social psychological evidence, that if that's your goal, it tends to make you less happy because it tends to undermine the amount of time that you spend with other people in positive relationships in beneficial settings. Like it reduces the amount of time you spend working in your community or spends the time that you spend with your neighbors or with your family or other sorts of things. So there's lots of ways on the materialism, like moving away from materialism, putting into place policies and practices that would empower people, and putting into place policies and practices that would encourage certain forms of consumption over others, like consumption of durable, lasting goods rather than consumable, throwaway goods. That could go a long way, right? And this is like the good example that people like to talk about is the eating lots of meat, a meat-heavy diet, right? It's actually healthier if you reduce the amount of meat consumption. Like that's a win. And it's good for the planet. And it's good for animal welfare because the concentrated animal feed operations cause very serious suffering to the animals involved. So there's loads of ways on population, on consumption, on conceptions of the good life, where we can find, I think, these wins, and that's what we have to aim for.
Yep, absolutely. There's certainly no reason not to be going after if it's making everybody better off. The only question is why we're not doing it already.
And that would probably be more of a political question, I would guess. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, probably don't have time to open that can of worms. So I guess I'll just thank you for joining me today. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been a really fascinating conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me. This has been good fun.